Amen. So the first question was, it's from a sister, and she's married to someone who is not a Seventh-day Adventist, and I presume he's not a Christian, but I don't know. I'm not sure if the question is actually relevant to whether or not this person is a Christian or not. I suspect in the person's mind it may be, but the question is, how do you live as a couple when you have different sex drives or a different libido? That means one person desires or has a drive to have intimacy much more often or out of synchronization with their spouse. I'm guessing that the person has made this comment that she's married to a non-SDA or a non-believer with some kind of idea that someone in the world who's either not an Adventist, not in the movement, or not a Christian, that their sexual needs are in some way different to a Christian's. And perhaps I should begin by saying, I think often the way we as Christians view our sexuality, I don't know if we all know the word prudish, but it's certainly backward and archaic. And I think some of that is based upon the Victorian language and the Victorian dispensation in which Ellen White lived, and some of her thoughts, her perspectives of people's love lives, I want to say first of all are not actually in sync with what you read in the scriptures. For instance, Song of Solomon, and in the Bible sexual imagery is used much more explicitly than it is in Ellen White's writings. So I just want to begin by saying I think too often our perspective, the framework that we have about what is acceptable or unacceptable perspectives of intercourse or sexuality is not a Christian issue. It's actually an issue of dealing with people who are from a Victorian age. Obviously I use the word Victorian because of the Queen Victoria, but I think most people understand that. The 19th century basically, and we need to be careful that we don't frame everything from that perspective. So I just want to say that to begin with, and then the point I'm trying to drive at is that I'm not persuaded that people who are not Christians have either different sexual drives or sexual desires than Christians do. And let me be more pointed about my response. What I'm suggesting is that I don't think the needs and desires of a Christian, when we come to their sexual fulfillment or their sexual desires, is very much different than it is for any other religious body of people or someone in the world or an atheist. So I just want to make that point. When it comes to intimacy, I think far too often we have different views on not only the function of sex, but the way sex is performed and the enjoyment level that we may or may not get. So without getting explicit, what I want to say is the following. Now this is a very simplistic overview. I'm not an expert on the subject by any means. I'm not trying to portray that I am an expert. But what I want to suggest, and I say this is at a very simple level, you can read about it, you can go to counselling, and you can become much more knowledgeable about the subject. But I want to suggest the following. Couples when they have intercourse, that sexual act can, in a very simple way, be broken down into 3 types of sex, 3 types of experiences that this couple can have. So I'm not going to name them particularly, but I'm just saying there are 3 types. And these 3 types, if I can say it in a very simple way, vary in quality from the least satisfying to the most satisfying. So if we could say number 3 is the most satisfying sexual experience that a couple can have, it's not that they would necessarily both come to orgasm. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but if it did, it would be indicative that this was a really pleasurable experience. The reason why I say it's not indicative of orgasm, because you can have orgasm at any of one of those 3 levels. So level 1, I'm saying this is the least pleasurable experience that a couple could have. And if I could phrase it this way, this may sound harsh and ugly, and I don't mean it to sound that. If I could call it like a service. I'll give it another idea, another connotation, and I want to say it's in body, not spirit or mind. So at this level of intimacy, you will perform the act, but you're not really engaged in it. Your emotions, your feelings are held back, and you're essentially just going through the motions. You're just going through the act, and it's not that you're being forced to do this, and this is not rape. This is basically just you are emotionally disengaged, and you have intercourse with one another in the hope that it would solve your problems, but it really doesn't. And this can become a long-term chronic problem for many couples. They end up having sexual relationships at this level for far too long on far too many occasions, where they're just going through the motions thinking that this is the right thing to do. And both could potentially have orgasms. They may enjoy it in the moment, but it doesn't have a lasting emotional stroke spiritual fulfillment for either one of the couple or both of them. Often it ends up degenerating that both of them are struggling. So this is if I can call it, the worst type of sex to have. You're in this, you go through the motions because you think it's your duty to do this, but it really is not beneficial. It's not what sex was meant to be. And I'm suggesting that far too many people live their relationships at this level. So level 2. So this one is better. But the problem with this is that many of us have got emotional baggage, or we're anxious, or we don't feel comfortable about ourselves, we're nervous, so we have intimacy to find self-worth. So can be a man or a woman, it doesn't matter which gender you are. So we find our self-worth, our value at this level. Often women can fall into this trap because the way society across the world, when I say society I'm saying the human condition, is the way women have been sexualized, and in so many cultures, so many instances, they are brought up thinking that their value that they have in society, the value that they have to their spouse, is dependent upon how beautiful they are, how functional their bodies are, and what service they can provide. This can range from your ability to cook, your ability to clean, but when it comes to the bedroom, it's your ability to perform. And so too often people have intercourse with one another to relieve anxiety. That if they perform well, they can sort of pass the test, and if you did a score on your partner's performance, they would pass or fail, and if you did well you would pass, and it would address your anxiety, how you feel. This is not a healthy experience to have, but again, far too many people are in this one. This is somewhat better than this, because at least you're engaged emotionally at this level, as well as the act itself. So it does bring temporary emotional relief, but we can all see that there's a trap in here, because when we come together as a couple, you cannot perform successfully 100% of the time. In fact, most couples don't really make a success of an encounter that often, and therefore your anxiety levels will remain, and your feelings of unworthiness will still be there, and that sexual act, instead of helping, can actually make you feel worse. But at least you're engaged emotionally. So there's this, you're in the body but not in your mind. You're just doing this as a service. Often what we will do is to save ourselves from fighting, from having to engage with a partner that we're not happy with. People just have sex just to kind of bury things. So they use it as an escape route. As long as we're here sort of physically, you can kind of shut down on your partner. That's one. Number two, we're anxious, we don't feel worthy, and therefore if we perform well in the bedroom, we can kind of get through difficult patches, because our spouses will think good of us and we will think good of ourselves. And then obviously number three is when both partners come together, and sexual intercourse, intimacy, is what it was designed to be. An emotional, spiritual and physical experience that both of you enter into, and you truly, for that brief moment, become one flesh. Of course, sexual intercourse is a very strange act when you think about the mechanics of what you're doing. You're opening yourselves up in a way that is very, if you were to think about it, quite unnatural. Most of us feel much more comfortable covered with our clothes. We have sensitive body parts that we want to hide, that look different, that feel different, that smell different, and we want to protect ourselves in case people would not be pleased. And so to expose yourself to someone's, intimate knowledge of your body is a really fascinating experience if you think about it. Just kissing somebody, allowing someone to come into your space when you think about all the things that are wrong with you, your bad breath, that you haven't brushed your teeth, what you've just eaten, all of those things, to allow someone to enter that close to you is really something unique and special. I'm not saying it's unique to humanity, but it is a unique experience, and so intimacy is really, really important, and that's where number 3. So I'm just going to write, you have a mind-body connection in yourself. As I say, what we're not gauging here is whether a person has had an orgasm or not. That is a different marker, because I'm assuming most of us are adults here, we would all know, I think, that men can have an orgasm relatively easily at any one of those levels. They can even have an orgasm here at 0 pretty easily without actually doing anything. So orgasm is not a marker of a good experience that you've had in the bedroom. I say bedroom not because it only needs to be in the bedroom, but just as a symbol of what we're referring to. So the first thing is, when we talk about tension because of a couple's or an individual in a couple, their different needs, the first thing that we want to point out is that even if you had the same sexual drive, that you both wanted or were content to have intercourse twice a week or once a month or whatever that number was, you can still get into problems just at this level. And I think this is important for couples to explore, and too often it's something that they will not talk about, either because they're ashamed or because they're not knowledgeable that there are these problems in sex. That people think as long as you're in bed and you're going through the motions and the mechanics are all working, that everything's okay and you've done a good job. But it isn't. There is an emotional, mental experience that you go through individually in your own, obviously in your own minds, that can either have you at level 1, 2 or 3. And often couples either will not talk about it because they're embarrassed, or they don't even know. Can you imagine if your spouse told you that you thought they were enjoying intimacy here, but for the past 5 years they've been here just in body and not in spirit, and basically they've been faking things? Can you imagine how hurt you could feel? Can you imagine the pressure that would be on them not to tell you? So it is really important to discuss these things, and I think this is more important than discussing people's mismatch of libido. This is a 2-part question. I'm just going to read the second part of the question. How do we respect equality in the management of sexual desire? So it's a related question. It's just given the same question with a slightly different perspective. And there's a third part. Is there a compromise? Is there a notion of compromise or concession to be made? So I just want to try and combine all of those thoughts together. Sorry?
Sorry, I was just say it again, the one you just read, the second one.
Can I say it?
Yeah, the bit about quality in reference
Okay.
to quality. Sorry, just to repeat.
You have the questions there.
No, that one's not lovely.
It's right at the bottom. How to respect equality in the management of sexual desire. How do we have equality in here? So the first thing I think that's more important than how often you desire to have sex is this. Because if someone has desires 3 times a week and one only desires it once a week, at least when you do it the once, if that's what you ended up agreeing on, you would try to know where you are on this scale and try to address points 1 and 2. I want to say that points 1 and 2 cannot be addressed in the bedroom. These are not bedroom issues. These are not physical issues. These are mental issues that a couple need to talk through and to be able to understand one another. So these can't be fixed in the bedroom to get to this. And I think even though the questioner may have found herself in this dilemma, she doesn't say who has the strongest sex drive, her husband who's not a Christian or herself. I'm suspecting it's the husband, but I can't know that for sure. And I want to say to the sister, what's actually more important, I would suggest, is to know where you are when you do have intimacy one with another. If you're just going through the motions, if you're having intimacy to fulfill your anxieties, just to make you feel better that you have some worth because you can perform and make your spouse happy, or you're at number 3, that you are both fully engaged in mind, body and spirit, and it becomes a beautiful experience. So to me that's more important than the fact that you have different drives. Now when we talk about different sex drives or different libido or equality in the management of sexual desire, there are 2 things. I've mentioned a number of times already the issue of quantity, which I think is obvious. You know, some people once a month, once a fortnight, once a week, every day, twice a night, whatever that number is, there is a quantity where 2 people can be adrift one from another. It will be rare that 2 people will come together who have that same desire in the frequency. There will always be some mismatch. The question is the degree of mismatch. So that's one thing about having this tension where intimacy means more to one person than it does to another. So besides the quantity, then there is, I just want to call it the quality. And what I mean by that is not what I've spoken of here, whether it was good or bad. It's what is acceptable or unacceptable in the bedroom. What physical acts do you believe are okay, and what physical acts does your spouse believe that is okay? And again, I think a couple need to work through their differences about different positions, whether they would engage in oral sex, which by the way the dictionary definition is sodomy. I don't know if we're all aware of that. Oral sex by definition is sodomy. Sodomy is not just confined to homosexual relationships. Heterosexual couples who have oral sex are engaging in sodomy, if you just go with the dictionary definition. Now, I suspect that a number of Christians would be opposed to oral sex, and it's not for me to tell you what your acceptance level should or should not be, but I think this should be a frank and open discussion between a couple. So besides oral sex, I've mentioned positions, I've mentioned oral sex, and the third one I just want to mention is masturbation. Whether or not a couple would masturbate one another, and we might call that foreplay, and sometimes foreplay may be not just a means to an end, it may be the end in and of itself. So, as I say, it's not for me in a discussion such as this to talk about the rights and wrongs of those 3 issues, which I suspect for some of you are controversial. I suspect for some of you, your ears may be ringing just even mentioning those words in a discussion such as this, which is obviously on Christian relationships. But I think it's our neglect in speaking about these things openly and frankly that lead to, I'm going to say, many of the problems in relationships where couples don't feel at liberty to talk about such things. They feel that it's embarrassing or fundamentally wrong to talk about this with their spouse. So again, I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, but I am saying is if a couple or your spouse desires to have intimacy with you outside of regular intercourse, which, as I've said, would be different positions, would be oral sex or sodomy, and the third one I mentioned was masturbation. All of those are outside of frequency, by the way. And I think those 4 points need to be discussed when there is tension in a marriage. I want to suggest for the vast majority of couples, they can work out the differences, or as the person asked, this tension in the desire that one person would have, or one person's sex drive or libido is far higher than the other. If you were to discuss those 4 points candidly and openly, I think most couples can resolve many of the tensions that they are having in their bedroom if they're open and frank about these issues on those, either all or one of those 4 points.
Can you go a bit slower?
Okay, I'll try to get a bit slow. So, on top of those points, what to me is more important is when you do have intimacy, that you try to remember that there are degrees or qualities of intercourse. As someone has asked me, am I saying that oral sex is good or bad? And I've said twice already that it's not for me to comment on whether it's good or bad. I think couples need to work that out by themselves, and if they're not able to resolve that by themselves, they should seek for some kind of counselling, either secular or in the movement, in the church, to try to work out for themselves the rights and wrongs of this. I don't think I want to be the arbitrator on something that's so sensitive to people. So the last part of the question was, is there a notion of compromise or concession to be made? And I don't like this idea of the words that have been used of compromise or concession. What I think is that a couple should work together as a team, and I think teamwork is a far better, far more healthier model than compromise or concession. Because if you work on the idea of concession, what you can end up having is sexual relationships here, where your body is going through the motions. It could be the man or the woman. I'm not arguing that more often than not it's the woman, that your body can be here, but you're not enjoying what you're doing. You're shut down emotionally and you're just going through the act. And what would be perhaps the saddest thing is if you were pretending to actually enjoy it. And there are so many stories, real life stories, not only in the world, even in the movement, where women, particularly women, will actually fake enjoyment when they're at level 1. They'll hide the fact that there is no real deep pleasure there, but they will just pretend that there is. And to me, that's what concession or compromise sounds like. And I would suggest, rather than thinking about it in those terms that this should be teamwork. I would venture to say that for most couples, if they put forth the effort that they could meet one another's sexual needs in a way that both of them find fulfilling. It doesn't mean that if a person desires sex every evening that they will have that, but there are ways of actually having a healthy sex life beyond what we might call compromise. So to me, it's not saying if one wants 5 and one wants 1, we'll compromise and do 3. I don't think that's the best way to approach this subject. It's much more nuanced, much more complicated. Second question. So again, this is from a sister in the movement, so I guess this is a real life situation. She's married to a Seventh-day Adventist who's not in the movement. And her question is, how should a woman, I don't know if this is theoretical, but I'm assuming because of the detail that she gives, this is real life, so I'm going to say, how should this sister react to her husband's verbal and psychological abuse? She actually says violence, but normally we call this abuse. And her husband has a sexist view of life. So for a husband to be verbally and mentally abusive, by definition, I would say, would make them sexist. Of course it would. Because of the word itself, sexist, I think sometimes we have a very narrow definition of that, and too often we think about it as just how a man treats a woman, which is its purest definition, I guess. But if we think about sexism in terms of equality, then we know that this man has no idea about what equality is, because equality is treating your spouse respectfully and properly. So this husband has no idea how to treat his wife respectfully, and what she's having to endure is both verbal and mental abuse. Our position in the movement is quite straightforward and explicit, that nobody, man or woman, child or parent, should have to endure any form of abuse. So when I say any form of abuse, of course we mean in the sense of a criminal activity. Now, we might argue about, even the legal system might argue what would count as criminal abuse. But I think most of us who think about this subject know when we see abuse. If a person is unsure that they are being abused, it's quite easy for them to seek for help. They can either seek for help professionally, secularly, or within the movement, or if they knew someone within the church even that was skilled or versed in this subject. Often the first port of call may be your doctor or your general practitioner. They're often a good source. If you don't know where to go, they can point you in the right direction quite often. If you have a trusted friend, a trusted elder, someone that you look up to, they can also be a good source as an initial help to determine whether or not this would be considered as abuse. So our position is, how should a woman react to her husband's verbal and mental abuse? We would say that there is no reason for anybody to be abused, and that means that we think that people should leave their abusive relationships. They should not remain in an abusive relationship. It serves no one any good, either the abuser or the abused. It doesn't help. Far too often, women who are mothers will remain in an abusive relationship for one of two reasons. The two reasons why most women remain in an abusive relationship is money and children. And whilst it's easy for me to say they're bad reasons for remaining, we recognise that they are reasons, and I would suggest that far too many women remain in abusive relationships because of these two issues. The first one, I tend to call it a poverty trap. So this poverty trap that many women find themselves in is often caused by one primary problem, which is education. It's not only education, but often this is the driver. Often they will have had children and they'll have to leave their career or their job, even if they were educated before, even if they had a profession. Often couples are driven to the point where they come to an agreement that one will work and one will remain at home and be the housekeeper, if you like. 99% of the time it's women that do that, and therefore they become reliant upon their husband's ability to bring in the money. And if things go wrong, they can get into as I say, this position where they cannot basically fend for themselves. If they were to leave, there would be no means of them earning money. For many sisters, they've got to this place because they have never been educated sufficiently to get a professional career that would allow them to pick up their career sometime after some kind of break in midlife, for instance. So the first thing when we talk about how a woman should react, the primary position is that women should not accept abuse. They should leave abusive relationships. And I'm just giving reasons why many don't. The number one is that they fall into this poverty trap that they either agree to voluntarily or they have been brought up in because society has this idea that women generally don't need to be educated. And it varies from country to country, but it's not unique to any one country. This is a problem with human beings in general. So for those sisters who are listening, wherever you are in your life experience, you could already be married, you could already have children, you may not be married, you may be single, you may be young enough, you still may be at school. I don't know where you are in your experience, but I would say the number one thing that you should really focus and concentrate on is your education, your ability to be able to take care of yourself in an emergency. And that emergency could come up for a number of reasons. Now, this is not some pie in the sky idea. This is one of those things that actually is, this idea is embedded in the spirit of prophecy that Ellen White speaks of, not just men but women being able, having the ability to take care of themselves. Now, in Ellen White's day and age, 200 years ago, it was a completely different world, it was a completely different proposition on how a woman could take care or fend for herself. We live in a different world, and realistically the only way you can do that is through education. It's vital that each of us have some kind of career, some kind of profession which in most situations demands some kind of education, and it's critical that particularly sisters choose a career wisely if they are at the beginning and have a clean sheet of paper with this idea in mind that if they do marry and they do have children, that at some point in the future they will be able to pick up their careers after, we have a term here in the UK of mothballing their careers. They've put their careers on hold and they could revitalise them later on in life when, or if the opportunity demands it. So I think women should think carefully about their career choices and try to choose a career that would enable them to do that. There are many careers that do allow this, either part-time working or allow you to come back into the profession 10, 15, perhaps even 20 years later with some re-education. So I think that's the number one reason why women tend not to walk away from abusive relationships, and the other one is children. Now, the sister does not talk specifically about what the abuse is. She mentions verbal and mental abuse, but we know, statistics will tell us, that often things go from verbal to mental to physical abuse. And once a man gets to physically abuse his wife, often it leads to abuse in the bedroom. And if you have daughters and you are already in a situation where your husband is verbally and mentally abusing you, you should be very careful about protecting your children, particularly if you have daughters, because there are too many situations where the abuse would turn from the wife to the children. So even though people will remain in a marriage relationship because of their children, again, that is something to really consider and take heed to. In these types of situations, I think people will be well advised to seek for initially help or assistance from, I'll call it someone spiritual in the movement. It doesn't have to be an elder, it could be a sister of experience or a brother of experience, your local general practitioner, your GP, depending on what country, I think it might be your primary care provider, the doctor who's the first point of contact that does all of your, takes care of your general health. They're often a good point of contact to find out what help is available to you so that you can determine the risk that you are at. Sometimes these situations can be turned around if you can go into counselling to try to understand why a husband is behaving in that way. But what we would say is that it is completely wrong and inappropriate for a woman to think that because she's a Christian or someone in the movement and her husband is either not a Christian or not in the movement or is separated, that she has to put on a show or a performance, which basically means that she has to accept abuse so that she gives some kind of witness. This is completely wrong and inappropriate, and it just perpetuates sin, and we should not engage in that. It's not good for the wife, it's not good for the victim, it's not good for the perpetrator, and if you have children, it's certainly not good for them. So I'm hoping that answers that question. So, someone has asked, related to this question, it's easy enough for me to say, just leave. But if you know someone who's in an abusive relationship, you will know often they are unable or unwilling to leave. There are so many cases where someone has actually got into physical violence against their wife, and their next door neighbours have heard something going on in their home. the police are called in, a woman is actually hurt, a black eye or broken wrist or a fractured rib or something, and the police are willing to have charges pressed against their husband, but the woman won't do that. And they just keep on going back to this abusive relationship. And the question is, what do we do in situations like that? I'm sure that I'm really not capable or qualified to answer a question of that seriousness, of that complexity. It's okay for us to talk like this and say, well, she should just walk away, she should leave, she should be strong. But the reality is, far too many women, and it is mostly women that find themselves in this situation, don't have the courage or the strength. Somehow or another, they are unable to deal with this, with the trauma of their marriage, and they go from day to day, good days, bad days, just living with this abuse. As I say, I'm not qualified to say why or what, how to combat a woman who's going through these experiences, except to basically say that we should rally around her, we should give her comfort and support, and help her to know that we will support her in her decisions. And the problem is, often those decisions that these women will make are bad decisions for themselves, for their families. And the worst thing to do, I would suggest, if you know someone in this situation, is if she's not willing to listen to you and says, he's not going to listen to common sense when you say, just leave. He fractured your rib next week, who knows what he will do to you. And they just remain. Often people have this idea that, well, I've warned them enough, and if they don't want to leave, they've made their own bed, they can lie in it. And that's the worst thing that we should be doing to someone in that situation. Just because they cannot handle the situation themselves, emotionally, mentally, it's indicative that they actually are support more then than ever. So even if you have or know someone that's in this situation where they just don't find themselves able to leave an abusive relationship, we should not abandon them. We should continue to support them and encourage them, and to show them that the healthiest thing for them to do, for everybody involved, is to walk away from those relationships. I'm not a psychologist, I don't have any formal training in any of these things, but I think most of us have an awareness that women who find themselves in these extreme situations often have a history of abuse, particularly from when they were growing up. They have left one abusive relationship and they've just entered into another, and so therefore it becomes quite difficult for them to manage these things. I think they deserve and need our love and care, and we should not be abandoning those people who find themselves in these difficult situations.
This is based on the previous question, but you can deal with it later on if you like.
Does that mean
it is? Whatever you're defining oral sex as, can you prove what it is?
I don't understand that. Someone's asked me a question, we're just trying to resolve what that... I don't even understand what the question is. Someone's asked the question, can I demonstrate or defend that oral sex is oral sex? I don't know what that actually means. Whoever's question that is, you need to ask it. If you're asking, can I defend that oral sex is sodomy, I don't know if that's your question. Maybe someone sent the question to Brother Leon, whoever's question that is, you know who you are. Could you resend it so that I can understand and perhaps answer your question? So, this was from some previous presentation. The questioner says, I have a question. What about those that have been married and are divorced? All circumstances, I'm sure, vary from situation to situation, I agree. I was married and divorced long before I was a Christian. My experience has just made it to where I choose to not remarry. Some things could have been easier with a husband. I didn't want to risk a stepfather for my children in the event that they may not like me, things may not work out. They already had to deal with an alcoholic father, their real father. So I became a Christian, and in my growth I just wanted to apply all my time and life to the Lord and knowing the truth. Adding a relationship would have divided my time and affections. So I'm trying to ascertain what actually the question is being asked here. So I'm just going to go through this again. This sister, it's obviously a sister from the context, was married and divorced before she became a Christian. She became a Christian. She's obviously entered into the movement. She has children. She decided not to remarry because she didn't want to take the risk that there would be problems between her new husband and her children. Often stepfathers and their stepchildren, they can not get along well with one another, particularly if the children are older and they don't have time to integrate with the new spouse. Their previous or their real father was an alcoholic, so they'd already had problems with him, and she didn't want to add to their problems. And the other reason why she didn't want to remarry was that she wanted to completely dedicate herself I guess to serving the Lord, ministry work, whatever that looked like. She didn't want to get distracted in the relationship and divide her time between a human and I guess what she views of her as her mission. So these are just comments or background about who she is and her thoughts. And it's not for me to tell anybody that they should marry, that they have to have a partner. And we discussed this in, I think, I think the first presentation that we did together, that what do young, I shouldn't say young, they often are, but what should single people do if they're happily single? Do they have to marry? Do they have to find a partner? And the obvious answer is no. Now, we are designed, if I just call it this way, to be pleasure seekers. And that pleasure that we're driven to desire is the pleasure of companionship. And we can use different words for companionship. I'm just going to use three. Companionship is one, affection is another, and the last one, the obvious one, is love. So companionship, affection, love. I'm going to use those terms synonymously, one with another. I believe that we are driven, that we are created to seek for that. These things give us the most intense pleasure. And I would argue that the reason why this sister can find pleasure in what she calls ministry work, she didn't use that phrase, she said she wanted to apply all of her time and life to the Lord and knowing the truth. What I suspect is what's happening in her life, that the fulfillment of human affection, human companionship, human love can be met and fulfilled in the church with, I just want to use the term, members or brothers and sisters. Some people might say brethren, depending on the phraseology that you use. It's fellow believers. For many of us, we can find fulfillment, certainly pleasure, in having these relationships outside of marriage. Of course, all of this is missing, this sexual intimacy, but I did discuss a few weeks ago that sexual intercourse is only one part of a relationship. And the problem with sex at level 1, the problem with this is that most people think that physical interaction, physical sex basically, will fix people's problems, and it doesn't. What ends up happening is, if you try to use sex to fix your relationship problems, you end up driving a harder and harder wedge between yourselves, and you end up having this service industry type of relationship where you just, I think you're all familiar with the term, you just go through the motions, and it's a very dangerous way, it's very unproductive, it's a very damaging way to live. So we can have quite fulfilling relationships. Most of us have platonic friends who can meet our needs, not the ultimate need of having intimacy, but as Paul says, some people were born eunuchs and some people have become eunuchs for the sake of the gospel. And I think that's what this sister is explaining, that she was more than happy to be a eunuch for the gospel. And that's fine. I want to remind us, lest we think that Paul was so noble and honourable that he forsook all of the pleasures of life for the gospel. I do want to remind us, where do you ever see Paul by himself? That he's not with people, that he's not with friends or companionship. You can find a number of instances where he basically cries out for human companionship, affection, love. He gets them from his work, we can call it his work colleagues, his assistants. There's Timothy, who is like a son to him. There's Luke, who never seems to leave his side. These people are meeting his spiritual and emotional needs. So it's completely appropriate, if a person doesn't want to enter into marriage, for them to have their emotional needs met by friends, family, people in the church, people in the movement. You don't have to have physical sex. And I think, as I've already said, if you get sex and put it on the wrong footing, it can be more detrimental than beneficial. It will not fix most of people's problems. Once you're one mentally and emotionally, then that physical union becomes something that is really unique. And I have already argued that it becomes a spiritual experience, not just this hot, passionate 15-20 minutes or whatever, however long you are together in the bedroom. That act becomes much, much more significant, and it only happens at level 3. I don't mean that it can only happen with Christians, by the way. Many people in the world experience this type of intimacy, this pure, unadulterated love. So, in my prayer, which is what the sister's referring to, which is why she brought this up, was that I spoke about those people who desired, were happy to remain single. They didn't desire or have the need to be in a relationship, to be married, and I said that was perfectly fine. And I think my sister here is basically bearing testimony that she is in that position, and she seems to be comfortable in that. Now, following all of that, I don't know if she's listening today. I don't know if I've begun to persuade her to change her thinking, to change her mind, or she has been thinking about it more, or I don't want to say the Holy Spirit is persuading her or anything, but after making that initial statement, and after hearing the prayer, after hearing the discussion about a sister who had asked the question, is it okay to have joy in being single? And I said, of course it is. It's perfectly fine. This questioner, my sister, she acknowledges that. Perhaps her reasons were different. The original questioner was single. This questioner had been married, had been divorced, chose not to remarry for the sake of her children, and also because she didn't want to lose her focus on serving the Lord. But she then goes on, it's a multifaceted question. She said, I had thought for a while seeking relationship and marriage was not the best thing to do, because it was dividing our time from the Lord and His work. So if you only have 8 hours in a day, you're going to end up giving 4 to God and 4 to this other person. And she thought, well, that's a waste of time. We should give everything to the Lord. And this is how she had been thinking for quite some time. Now, I don't know what's changed in her mind. Maybe it's because I'm passionate about relationships. I don't know. I'm passionate about lots of subjects. I'm not saying this is my only subject that I feel passionate about. I feel passionate about a number of different things, and those who know me well can testify to that fact. But I do think relationships are an important thing. I really do. And if you haven't watched the classes, when I say the classes, I mean my specific ones, from Portugal earlier this year, I would recommend, if you're interested in seeing my perspective of this, prophetically speaking, not relationship wise, of why I think this is significant. It gets addressed there at a prophetic level, why this becomes such a significant issue. Maybe this sister watched all those presentations and that's helped her to rethink things. She then goes on to say, but I do see the benefits of what relationships teach us in our relationship with the Lord. And this is why I think that she has begun to rethink things. Because this is the very point, the theological point that was being addressed in Portugal. That our relationships here do teach us more about God than we perhaps realise. He then goes on to say, and no, it's not something that I'm seeking to pursue. I just wasn't sure if others had similar thoughts. So she's asking on behalf of all of you folks who may be in this predicament or this dilemma, to ask, is it a waste of time finding a relationship? And I don't know if you have your Bibles to hand, but I want to turn to a Bible passage to answer this question. And it's taken from Proverbs 18:22. Proverbs 18:22. So this is my answer to you, my sister. I'm not trying to persuade you to find a relationship with somebody. If you're content to be single, praise the Lord. However, so, Proverbs 18:22 says, whosoever findeth a spouse findeth a good thing and obtaineth favour of the Lord. So I want to suggest that it is not only okay to desire to be in a relationship, it's actually a good thing. And God shines favourably upon those who find a good partner, who find someone that they can join themselves to, mind, body and spirit. As I said, it's not for me to try to persuade anybody one way or the other what they should be doing with their lives. And if a person finds joy and happiness in remaining single, I would defend their right to do that. I would say amen. But what I would say, because she speaks about other people having similar thoughts, so this is not just for my sister, but this is for anybody who's listening. I would suggest the following. I think it's an unhealthy way of looking at life to compare two things. To compare, if we had 24 hours in a day and we sleep 8 hours and therefore we have 16 hours a day, and we eat and we bathe, etc., and if that was 3 hours a day, that we would have 13 hours left, and if we were in some kind of employment at 8 hours, therefore we would have 5 hours left. What I would say is the following. If we come down to this reductionist mindset that we have 5 hours in the day and we can choose between A and B, and A is God and B is a human companion, I think this type of reductionist perspective is not only wrong, I actually think it's unhealthy. And it's unhealthy mentally, emotionally and physically. Now, this is not to say if a person finds joy, happiness in spending all of their time serving God, this is perfectly fine. But what I would seek to caution people about is if they think that finding human companionship is a distraction or a waste of time, I don't think I agree with that perspective. And I would venture to say, I don't know if I have this authority, don't know how good he and I are together on this, that I would venture to say that I don't think God would agree with that idea either. That it's a waste of time sharing yourself between a human and God. I don't want to go into the details of all of that. Please refer to those presentations in Portugal. I know there are a vast amount of those presentations, and I wouldn't be able to tell you to point to which numbers they were. There are over 100 presentations. But what I would say is ask yourself the following question. Why do you want to go to heaven? What is the purpose of that? What do you think that you will be doing in eternity? And the reason why I ask that question is a rhetorical question, because the answer is obvious. The answer is you want to go to a place, you want to be in a place where our relationships with our friends and families are intact and safe. And in heaven, we will divide our time between God and humans. And I see no reason why we would think it would be wrong for us to do that here on earth. Often the arguments that are put forth on these are ones that Paul used, and depending upon one's perspective, one's reading that you may or may not have done, there is reasonable evidence to indicate that Paul was once married, and the reason he does not marry we can speculate about, but I would suggest at least one of them was his particular work that he was involved in didn't lend itself to a regular normal marriage. Essentially he was a travelling apostle, and he was always on the move, and perhaps he decided that him being married would not work out so well. He lived in a time period perhaps where he and his wife, If he had a new wife, wouldn't be able to travel together. There may have been a number of reasons, but I think it's dangerous for us to use his example and project it upon ourselves en masse into the 21st century. I'm sure most of you have some awareness of Ellen White and the work that she undertook as a prophet, as a wife, and as a mother. And she ordered her family in a way that if you were to take her writings as plainly read, she stood in contradiction to what she had written in her counsel to married couples. So I think we need to be careful about using prophets in these difficult situations as our examples. I would suggest that everything with the great controversy, pre-great controversy, post-great controversy is all about relationships, and we just can't get around that. And it's not just our relationship with God, it's also our relationship with other fellow beings, whether they are human, whether they are animal, and hopefully into eternity beings from other worlds. So I think this reductionist mindset that this is time wasting to have relationships with people, that it would detract from our having a relationship or having a mission for God. I guess I just don't agree with that fundamentally. That it's wrong. This is not to say that if someone, like my sister, like in fact my other sister, who wants to remain single, that there is something wrong with that. There is not. I would embrace someone's desire to remain single. I think it's healthy, I think it's appropriate, I think it's good. If they want to dedicate themselves to God, they can do that at an individual level. It's fine for that to happen. But I think, by and large, for the vast majority of us, this is not the way that we would live. I don't think it's even the way that God desires us to live. He certainly didn't construct us this way. Just as by way of a parable, we'll know that full-time workers are supported by tithe, and tithe is 1/10 of a person's salary. So just a simple math will tell you that in any kind of organisation you would have no more than 10% of the people in that organisation as full-time workers, elders, Bible workers, ministers, etc. No more than 1 in 10. So it's not common to have many full-time workers. And I'm just using that as an analogy to say that some people would prefer to completely dedicate themselves to full-time ministry. I don't mean that they don't have a secular job. I mean that they don't want to get into a relationship with someone. They may choose to do that, but it's not the normal practice that most of us would enter into. It's not the human condition. In fact, the human condition is completely opposite. We are driven to desire 3 things, all the same thing: companionship, affection, and love. You cannot deny your humanity. So I'm hoping that I answered that question. And part of that question was, the sister doesn't want to marry, but if she did, is she allowed to remarry? This becomes problematic when we consider people's experiences before they became Christian, the dynamics of the breakup in their relationship, what has happened since. So I don't think it's easy for me to answer that in a public setting. I think questions such as that need to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis to see whether or not people can remarry. So I'm hoping I answered that question to that person's satisfaction.